I'm going to call this work session to order. Today is Friday, August 9th. We are noticed from 1 to 2 p.m. in this work session, and we will start with introduction, and then we'll move into our presentation.
Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley. And on the phone, we have Mr. Martinez,
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Mr. Johnson,
I'm here.
and any other members on the phone? Okay, and then we also have Assembly Council. We have members of the administration. I'll have you guys introduce yourselves shortly. And then I see a few folks in the back as well. So today we are going to be looking at a presentation and discussing our draft Housing and Community Development 2024 Action Plan. So I'm going to turn it over to members of the Health Department. Please introduce yourselves and then we can move into the presentation. And I'll also note that a copy of the presentation is online. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I am Jed Drolet, Community Systems Program Manager with Anchorage Health Department.
I'm Chase Burgrave, Lead Neighborhood Planner with the Health Department.
Good afternoon. My name is Darcy Montalvo. I'm the Human Services Division Manager with the Anchorage Health Department.
And I'll say also, we'll go through the presentation and I'll ask members if you have quick clarifying questions, we'll do those. And then maybe we can hold kind of more substantive questions till the end. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, members of the Assembly, for being here for this work session. I'm going to go ahead and do a presentation here about our 2024 Housing and Community Development Action Plan, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. All right. So like I said, I'm Jed Drolet, Community Systems Program Manager. We also have Chase Burgrave, who is our new Lead Neighborhood Planner. Over time, we're going to be transitioning more of the planning work over to him, so that will be one less thing on my plate. And then we also have my supervisor, Darcy Montalvo, our Human Services Division Manager, who oversees our programs as well as several others within the Health Department. So I'm going to give a little overview of the HUD planning process, and then I'll get into a little more detail about this plan, so you have a sense of the context of how we're operating and where this fits. So as an entitlement jurisdiction with HUD through the Community Planning and Development Programs, we are required to submit 3 plans/reports to HUD in order to receive that funding. So these are not competitive grants, but we do need to jump through all the hoops to get them, and these are the hoops. So we do a 5-year consolidated plan. This is kind of our high-level strategic plan where we set goals and priority needs for a 5-year period. We did our most recent one last year, so we're in the second year of the 2023 through 2027 consolidated plan. Then each year we have an annual action plan that sets out which specific projects we're proposing to fund to meet those goals that are set in the con plan. So the con plan and the action plans are very closely integrated, but they're separate types of documents. So the annual action plan is what we're looking at here for 2024. And then each year we have a consolidated annual performance and evaluation report, or CAPER. And this is a report to HUD that basically summarizes what we've done in that year with the funding that we've received. So we got our plans, our goals, and then we're measured up against them each year. It's kind of an integrated planning and assessment process, so they can see our progress on our goals. So the programs covered by the con plan that are managed by the Anchorage Health Department are Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG. This is our largest program, best known. We also have the Home Investment Partnerships Program, which is spelled with capital letters there, HOME, but it's actually not an acronym. It's just the word home. And then Emergency Solutions Grant, or ESG. And sometimes we do a sub-grant from the state of Alaska for the National Housing Trust Fund. We haven't done that in a few years, but we do sometimes manage that program as well. So this is just a chart of the last 5 years showing the actual amounts of our allocations with each of these funds. We don't have any control over this. This is based on funding formula for each program, and then the overall amount of money that Congress appropriates each year. which among other things means that we don't know exactly how much money we're getting until Congress appropriates the funds and HUD runs the calculations. But you can see in general, we get about a little less than $2 million in CDBG each year, generally about $600,000, $700,000 in home. And about $150,000, $160,000 in ESG. And then you can see for the past 5 years, we have not done a housing trust fund subgrant from the state. We did do a couple of those in previous years. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to briefly interrupt, letting you know that we were joined by a member of Holland a couple minutes ago. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to quickly go over the goals. This is really more the con plan that sets the goals, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but I just want to emphasize our primary goals here. The con plan sets out a bunch of goals, and part of the reason for that is that any project that we do within that 5-year period has to meet one of those goals to be eligible for the funding. So we tend to define those pretty broadly. But in terms of prioritization and how we're doing the action plans each year, major goals that we're focusing on are housing and services. These are set out in the con plan among other goals. But they're the main thing that we focus on. You know, it's consistent with anchored home and other planning processes that the municipality has gone through in recent years. Very clear that housing, homelessness is a big issue, and probably the biggest issue that our programs are targeted toward, that we can contribute toward with the relatively small amount of funding that we get. You know, we get $2 to $3 million a year between the 3 different programs. It's not a whole lot, but you know, it's something. And so we try to allocate that to meet this priority as much as possible. And here's just this is a graphic from the Anchored Home plan that the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness helped coordinate, which is the community strategic plan to address homelessness. So it's kind of a spectrum. You've got homelessness prevention on the one side, with prevention, diversion, retention, different ways of keeping people from becoming homeless in the first place, and then homelessness response ranges from services like outreach and emergency shelter and transitional housing through different types of supportive housing, rapid rehousing, independent, affordable housing. And then if you think of this as a spectrum, if you were to continue going to the right on here, you'd have like market rate housing and the general housing market. And that is a aspect of the issue that the Assembly does have some ability to affect through zoning and other code issues. But it's kind of out of the purview of what our programs do. Our programs mostly focus on this end of the spectrum. And so we look at the services and the housing needs in the community and try to fit our programs into those parts of the spectrum. So we're operating under some constraints, and I'm just mentioning a couple of these here. Very tight timelines. Again, we can't submit our plans until we know exactly how much money we have. And we don't know that until Congress appropriates the funds each year and HUD runs the formulas and calculates the allocations. That's typically in the spring of the year. So we're already, if you're thinking of it as a calendar year in which you're spending money, we're already a few months in by the time we know what we've got. And then we have a very hard deadline that is set in statute. HUD doesn't have any control over it. They can't waive it or extend it, of August 16th each year to submit the action plan. It's really a drop dead date. It's not even technically the deadline. The deadline's 30 days after we get the allocations, but this is the absolute, kind of go past that. And that kind of in recent years has driven the process and how we've been structuring our processes to meet that deadline, which is why we're here in August. Another constraint is limited funding. As you saw there, we get about $2 to $3 million a year. It's a very small amount relative to the scale of the problems that we're working at. So, we have to really think strategically about what is the best use of our funding. So a wide variety of things that are potentially eligible uses, but we really need to think through with this limited amount of funding, where can we leverage other funds, or where can we best use that for things that can't be funded in other ways. And then we also have some specific funding caps. So for example, under Community Development Block Grant, we can fund public services, but there's a cap of 15% of the allocation each year, which again ends up being not very much money. We always max out on, and we fund as much as we can in services generally. Like I said, that's a major priority. Another constraint, and this is important to note if you're kind of looking at our rate of spending, is that our grants with HUD are on a 100% reimbursement basis. We don't get any advances on these. So, and then our process typically is that we'll select grantees that will receive the funding from us. They'll do the projects and have to front the money. And so they'll have to have like a line of credit or reserves or some way of funding projects up front. They get reimbursed from us. Then we draw our funding from HUD for reimbursement. So there is inherently a lag between the time that the work is done and the time that it shows up on our books and then when it shows up on HUD's books. And this is just important context if you're hearing from HUD about how much they see that we have. There is a lag there, and there generally is more that we're spending on an ongoing basis than they see immediately, but they will see it, hopefully not too much later. We're trying to do draws as frequently as we can, but there is a lag there. It's a reimbursement basis. And so we're constantly doing this balancing between money coming in. We get a new grant each year. And then we have to get this planning process done. We have to contract with our grantees, and then they have to, do the work and then get reimbursed by us, and then we get reimbursed by HUD. So there's money coming in each year. There's money going out each year, but that can be a slow process, and so it can easily get backed up. And one thing we saw, for example, during COVID is that there became some constraints there that were clogging that process up. We're not in that place anymore, but we are constantly doing this balancing of the money we're coming in versus the money we're going out, because there's these deadlines that we don't have control over. So the consequences of these constraints and kind of the way that we're trying to address our goals through this process is we often know what kinds of projects we want to do when we're putting together the action plan, but we don't always have specific projects lined up in time to put into the action plan to meet those deadlines. And we have a strategy that we're kind of working toward to change our process so that we can get this done in a more efficient manner and not be in this situation. But we do still typically at this point often have a TBD. You'll see that in this plan. There's a couple of TBDs that we'll go back and amend the plan later after we select grantees, because we haven't gotten through the process yet of selecting them by the time we have to turn in the HUD plan to make those deadlines. And again, we're trying to get past that, but we're still working on it. So we have a strategy. 2024 is a little bit of a transitional year where we're moving from the way we've done things in the past. I took over managing the programs a little over a year ago. We're trying to move toward a more collaborative process where it's less kind of siloed within our team and within the health department. We're increasing staffing. We just brought Chase on. We've got a couple more people coming on in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. And that'll increase our capacity and enable us to do more things simultaneously, streamlining our processes, using more advanced project management tools, professional development, getting trained up, and redefining some of these timelines and processes so that we're able to do more simultaneously and do things more efficiently. So we are working on it. And I'll have more details about that a little later in the presentation. So then I want to also just give a little bit of information here about our past spending so you can see kind of how we have been spending these grants in the past few years, the different categories of projects that we've been doing. So by each program, we've got a little graph here. We actually put these together for an internal reporting process that we had, but I thought they'd be kind of good things to include in presentations as well. So for CDBG, we can see for the past few years, we funded a lot of affordable housing. That's primarily our mobile home repair program. Public facilities, we've done some upgrades to buildings that nonprofits have. The Alaska Literacy Project is one nonprofit that we've had a large project with on that in the past few years. Public services, we get that 15%, and so we've got that each year. And then admin and other. And you can see that the admin and other cut is looks a little large on the CDBG. We get 20% administrative cut of CDBG, which is larger than the other grants. So it is the largest cut of the largest grant, but it is the main source of administrative funding we have. It funds our salaries, supplies, things that are required to manage the grants. So for home, and you can see here especially that our funding is often pretty like blocky or chunky in that we don't tend to fund things on our funding doesn't come out necessarily on an ongoing basis because we are doing these large projects that often don't get complete in 1 year, but then will the next. So you can see we didn't have any spending. And these spending figures are based on our draws from HUD. So this is the last stage of the process. So basically in this case, we spent a bunch of money in 2020, but we didn't do a draw of that fund until 2021. So the 2021 funding there includes some projects that were actually done in 2020. And similarly for 2022 and 2023. And so you can see we've got affordable home ownership, rental housing development. So affordable home ownership, that's primarily our projects with Habitat for Humanity. Rental housing development is primarily projects with Cook Inlet Housing Authority. And then we've got tenant-based rental assistance that we've done in the past few years with NeighborWorks, and a small cut of, sorry, working better? Okay. Is that better? And then a small cut of administrative funding for home as well. For ESG, this is generally a small program, but we got a large influx of money through COVID-related funding that was kind of added on top of this. So you see there's a big chunk there. During that period, we funded homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, homeless outreach. What we generally use most of our ESG funding for is homelessness prevention through the Aging Disability Resource Center, which is part of the Anchorage Health Department, which is the green there. We also have a relatively small administrative cut of these funds. That's the dark blue at the top that you can see in 2024 year to date. That's relatively large because this is an admin / other category on the chart. And that actually includes a kind of one-off program we did where we funded some work by the Institute for Community Alliances that manages the homeless management information system for the state. We provide some funding for them through ESG, and that shows up as other in this system. So that's what that bit is on 2024. Then here we have, and I'm not going to go through this in detail. This is a very busy slide, but this is just a detailed spending of kind of where we're at with each of our active grants and what the deadline is for spending down all those funds. You can see we've got a couple of them coming up in September. We've got a little bit left. Those are long-term projects like that Alaska Literacy one, some Habitat for Humanity projects where, we're done with the projects or we're close to done with the projects, but we're kind of wrapping up either spending the last of the money or finishing the project up. And then, working through those older grants. And then we have the newer grants just recently put in place. So we have less of those spent down, but we have several years to do them. The CDBG and home are good for, 6 or 7 years. So we have some time to spend down some of those because we do these larger infrastructure projects that can take a few years to do. Bless you. So the process we're moving toward is to do a request for grant proposals to solicit projects in advance of putting the plan together. And the basic strategic direction that we're looking toward is to do fewer but larger projects than we've done in the past, leverage other funds, target those biggest community needs, housing supply, supportive services, and taking advantage of planning processes that have identified maybe particular types of housing, particular types of services that are necessary, and tailor the requests for grant proposals to get those particular types of projects, and then do a transparent, competitive process for selecting projects that will then determine the allocation of funding in the action plan. Now, that's not yet what we have in the 24 action plan at this point. So we have been working on an RFGP for housing acquisition projects. We were hoping to be able to have that done before we put the action plan together. Was not quite there. There's often delays in putting stuff together. This is it's not exactly a new process. We have done requests for grant proposals in the past, but not in a long time. The last one we did was in 2010. So we have some work to build on there, but also things have changed. So we're working on putting that together, but it's not ready yet. It'll go out pretty soon. It'll go out in mid-August, we're expecting. And then once we have those projects selected, we'll do a substantial amendment to the 2024 action plan to fund those projects in the spots in the plan that have TBD for now. And then the other funds that are allocated in the action plan will be allocated as they have been in recent years. Starting in, so then in 2025, and this is going to be actually at the same time, it's going to be the same RFGP will allocate the 2024 and 2025 funds. We'll kind of estimate the amounts that we expect to get in 2025 and select projects for that funding tentatively. Go through as much of the process as we can in advance. And then when we get the allocations in the spring, we'll be able to submit the action plan to HUD right away and not be bumping up against this August deadline again. We'll also be doing an RFGP for public services to allocate those funds as well. And then that will go into the 2025 action plan, which will be rolling out pretty soon. So, keep an eye out for that in the fall. And then in 2026 and subsequent years, we're going to continue to do that process where we'll have an RFGP. I think we'll have at least RFGPs for housing acquisition and public services, maybe others if other potential needs are identified. These will go out before the beginning of the program year, which is a calendar year for us. So these will come out in the fall before the year in question. And we will go through the RFGP process, select the projects, and then allocate them through the action plan and be ready to go when we get the allocations in the spring. So that's the general process and the direction we're moving. Now I just want to go over the specific projects that we're proposing in the 2024 action plan as it is at this point coming before the assembly on Tuesday. So we have some charts here. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but we'll have subsequent slides that will talk about those specific projects. This is the CDBG breakdown. This is the home, and this is the ESG. So for CDBG, the two big chunks of funding here is we'll have this acquisition for housing RFGP that's currently TBD in the plan, but those projects will be selected through that RFGP process over the next couple months. We also have the mobile home repair program. This is a longstanding program that we've been doing for over 20 years that does repairs to mobile homes to allow people to remain in their housing. We are currently finishing up an RFP process to select the next operator for that program. And so I actually just sent that over to purchasing. So hopefully we'll have that in place soon. Do you have a question there? Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead and move on.
Thank you. I might have spaced when you were describing this, but when you're talking about acquisition for housing, what is being acquired or what is that project?
Through the chair to Mr. Volland. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so it could be land, could be buildings, could be like a hotel that's being converted to housing, could be existing, unoccupied multiplexes that are going to be revamped for housing purposes, or it could be just raw land that is being acquired to build new housing on. And we're going to kind of frame that pretty broadly to kind of see what kinds of projects we get. Basically, acquisition projects are easier for us to do because if you don't get into construction, you don't end up having to comply with a lot more federal regulations that start to apply once you start doing construction work. And HUD considers acquisition-only projects to not be subject to those regulatory requirements. And so we're kind of trying to focus on acquisition for housing so that we can focus our funds to the niche where it's easiest to use our funds, and we can leverage them with other funds that might be easier to use for the rehab or construction part of a project, where we don't want to have to impose all of our requirements on what might be a much larger and more expensive project.
Okay, thank you.
And so for proposed services, so for we will in subsequent years be doing an RFGP for services as well. But for this year, we're as we've done the past couple of years, we're proposing to just continue to fund our current public service grantees for one more year at approximately the same level that they've been funded. So we've got Choosing Our Roots case management, Rural Cap homeless outreach, and Sitka Place case management, New Life Development residential reentry, and 9-star net to ladder employment training. And again, these are projects that we've been funding for a couple of years, and mostly oriented around homelessness outreach, case management, transitional housing, residential reentry, some of those sorts of related services.
Yeah, we have a second question from Mr. Bowen, and then I'll also just note that I forgot to say earlier, Mr. Salt is excused from this work session and our following work session. So go ahead, Member Bowen.
Thank you. So for these, since we are looking to fund them again via this grant source, I assume there's like reporting requirements for the success of these programs. Is that something that can be shared with the assembly?
Yeah, through the chair to Mr. Bowen. Yes, yeah, we require reporting of the demographics of the populations being served, and that's a reporting requirement that HUD puts on us. So we require that in all our agreements with our grantees, that they provide reports of who they're serving, how many people they've served, what their demographics are, and we can certainly share that information with the assembly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so for home, again, we have a couple of kind of larger projects here. Habitat for Humanity is what's considered a special category of organization called a Community Housing Development Organization, or CHODO, which is a HUD designation. We have a certain amount of our home funding that we have to set aside for CHODO funding. In recent years, that's been Habitat because they are currently the only CHODO in Anchorage. In previous years, there have been others. NeighborWorks has been one in the past. Rural Cap has been one in the past. I think Volunteers of America has been one in the past. So there is potential if we get some more CHODO certification of other organizations, we might have more options with that. For now, we just have Habitat. And so what we typically do is we'll do the CHODO set aside, and then we'll add some more regular home funding because the CHODO set aside is not large enough to actually do a whole project for Habitat. It takes them about $250,000 to do a project. So we add some more funding from the home to get that up to a full project. It's also a small set aside for CHODO operating assistance, so we have that for Habitat as well. For Cook Inlet Housing Authority, we're doing a large project, Spenard East Phase 2, for which we're giving them about $1 million across several different action plans. This $113,483 is the last increment of that. That'll complete the funding for the project. Didn't have enough in the current plans that we had at the time that we agreed to do this. So we were kind of added this additional from this action plan as well. And then again, through that RFGP, we've got a chunk of home funding that we'll use for acquisition for housing. For home, because of the way the requirements work, home is primarily focused on housing. And it also has some more stringent requirements in some ways than CDBG, especially for acquisition projects. This will most likely be for something like a hotel acquisition or an existing building where there's more of a defined plan for what the use is going to be and what type of housing it's going to be and who the residents are going to be. Whereas for the CDBG portion, that will probably be more like acquisition of land because there's more flexibility there. And then ESG, so this is a smaller grant. It's Emergency Solutions Grants. It was originally called Emergency Shelter Grants. They changed the name a few years back to kind of broaden the types of projects that people could use it for, but it's primarily focused on emergency shelter and homelessness prevention and kind of immediate needs. It also has a shorter lifespan. You have to use it within 2 years. So the past few years, we've generally been allocating the bulk of that funding to the Aging Disability Resource Center for their homelessness prevention program. So about $150,000 a year. I just put some outcomes here from our most recent CAPER covering 2023. They assisted 155 individuals. That was 84 adults and 71 children. Expended a little less than 200,000, which is more than 1 year of funding. The way the timing of these works, sometimes there's more than 1 year of funding within a calendar year. So that includes both some of the 2020 and 2022 funding. And the way this program works basically is people are at risk of being evicted, being kicked out of their housing. They can contact ADRC and they can work with them to get like a payment to keep them in place while they work things out with their landlord and prevent them from becoming homeless. So we're proposing to continue to fund that program. So some timelines, just to kind of show you where we're at and how these things interact. So 2024 action plan, we had meetings in the 2023, winter 2023, spring 2024. We had a public notice of the draft available in July 2024. Public comment period in July. Hearing was on July 17th. Assembly approval we're looking for now in August, so that's where we're at with this process, and then target submission before August 16th, 2024. And then flowing immediately from that, we'll have this request for grant proposals. So, we're drafting it now. We've got it almost done. We'll issue that later in August, have proposals in September, do a substantial amendment, which will come back to the Assembly for approval in October, and then get projects rolling out in November with the 2024 funding that is TBD in this plan.
Yeah, let me jump in really quickly. First, if I could ask you to pull the mic a little bit further away, we keep getting there we more than that. We adjusted it so you don't have to sit.
I
right.
see.
In fact, I don't need to do that either. I wonder before we move on if, because I know this item is on our agenda for the 13th, and because I know we probably have other questions, but in the meantime, can you clarify, you said the target date for submission is the 16th. Is that a hard deadline or is, okay. So essentially, we don't really have an option if we want to say postpone this to the next meeting. Like this is a must pass.
It is, and that's because this is that hard deadline that it doesn't have control over. It's set in statute, which is why we kind of have to put some TBD in there and get it submitted and come back and amend it later.
Thanks. And then one other question, you mentioned substantial amendment. So amendments can be, it sounds like when there's more specificity, these projects get figured out, the RFGP comes back, for example. And then amendments can also be made to kind of the direction. Is that correct? In theory?
So we can also do a substantial amendment to the con plan, which could change, make some changes to the goals and the priority needs and things like, and we probably will do a process like that in the next few months to kind of clarify what our general direction is with the overall strategic plan.
Thanks. And I bring that up just to note that I think there's a bigger conversation that I imagine folks want to have about kind of what we do with these funds long term, but I also want to emphasize that there is a timeline for this. And there is an opportunity to change it in the future as well. But I'm hearing that we have a pretty hard deadline of 1 week from now. So
yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And so then, so that's the timeline that we're looking at for the 2024 and then the RFGP. And then simultaneous with that, we'll be getting started on the 2025 action plan. So we'll be starting to do public meetings soon. Probably some of these will be the same meetings for multiple of these projects, basically. And probably get a public notice of draft for the 2025 action plan out around October. Public comment period and hearing in November, assembly approval around then, unless we have to wait until we have the exact amounts. We'll have to kind of figure out what is required there. But and then target submission in the spring once we get the HUD allocations announced. So consultation. So we do a lot of consultation. We've had, we talked to a lot of different entities in the community. The Housing, Homelessness, and Neighborhood Development Commission, HAND Commission, meets monthly. We attend all those meetings, generally give them an update on where we're at in our processes. They're kind of our advisory commission group. Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness and the Continuum of Care, they manage funds from HUD that are specifically focused on homelessness and have kind of a partnership with us. We have to be consistent with each other's plans. And so, we try to make our action plans consistent with their anchored home plan and their annual allocation cycle and vice versa. Community councils, both federation community councils and then individual community councils, particularly when we have a specific project in a specific neighborhood, we'll consult with that community council to let them know what we're proposing, get their feedback. Social service agencies, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, which is the public housing authority, as well as our state level equivalent that manages similar funds for the rest of the state. And then any other interested organization, we talk to a lot of people. If people are interested, we always invite them to contact us. We can set up meetings. We can meet with people either virtually or in person or whatever, and get all sorts of input on what people think we should be doing with our funding. So the comment period for this plan was July 1st to August 5th. It's a minimum of 30 days that's required by our citizen participation plan. We did a little longer in this case. We had a public hearing on July 17th. And then comments from during the period and the public hearing will be incorporated in the final plan. Could be some edits to the text, some clarifications, and then the comments themselves are also included in the draft. And so everything that people do comment goes to HUD as well. So that's all I've got for now. And I'll entertain any questions or discussions, and I'll put up our contact information here if anyone wants to reach out to us later.
All right, thank you very much. So we've got a couple folks in the queue. First, Mr. Johnson, then Mr. Boland. And if you're on the phone, you can text me. And if you're in the room, just wave me down. Thanks. So go ahead, Member Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. And my apologies if I just missed this in the presentation. I'm sorry. Could somebody mute their mic? I'm getting a lot of feedback. So I see that it looks like part of the CDBG funding is for acquiring properties, and I think you also mentioned rehabilitation in there. In those cases, what ultimately happens to the properties? Do you sell them back to the private market, or retain ownership and bring an operator? Kind of what's the end state there?
Through the chair to Assemblymember Johnson. Great question. Thank you. Yes, I didn't really go into it in this presentation, but the ultimate use of the properties will have to be consistent with the eligibility criteria for the program in general. And so for CDBG, typically that means it has to benefit low and moderate income families, whether that's through affordable housing or through the public facilities or public services. All those things have to meet that criterion. So if it's an acquisition project, we have to, even if we're not funding subsequent phases of the project, we still have to monitor it, keep an eye on it, and make sure that the grantee is doing something with the property that is eligible for the funding. With home, that has to be housing. With CDBG, it can be other things, although we're going to be focusing on housing with this funding. But that housing does have to meet the requirements of benefit to those specified populations to be eligible to receive funding, even for that upfront acquisition.
Okay, so in that case, would you retain the title to the property and then essentially lease it to an operator, or you actually dispose the property with certain conditions?
Through the chair to Assemblymember Johnson, we typically try to avoid having the property be municipally owned because that affects the period in which it has to continue to meet a national objective, which in some cases for CDBG is perpetual. So if it ever changes use and is no longer eligible, we have to pay back all the money that we spent on it. So what we typically will do actually is fund the acquisition, but we'll have a nonprofit partner that will be the actual acquirer and probably operator of the project. So if it's like Cook Inlet Housing Authority, typically they'll be acquiring some land with our funding, and then they'll be building something and continuing to own and operate it. That's the model that we typically try to do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boland.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Jed. I have, I guess, a couple questions. So certainly can appreciate this is probably a large scope of work in a department that is understaffed. I will just kind of say right at the outset, I don't love being put in the position of must pass, without a little bit more room to kind of for the assembly to give feedback after the public comment period. One question I have is having a large amount of TBDs in this plan, does that in any way make us less competitive or less likely to be approved for these grants? Is that a risk at all?
Through the chair to Assemblymember Volland. No, since it's entitlement funding, it's not a competitive process at all. And so as long as we document in the plan that our projects are consistent with the eligibility criteria for the programs and with our priority needs and goals in the con plan, HUD will approve them. They're not. Having a TBD, as long as we say in there that the projects that we eventually select are going to be eligible and designate which eligibility criteria and so forth, they're fine with that. It doesn't affect the amount of funding or anything.
Okay, great. My next question is about how many comments did you get in that public comment process from July 1st to August 5th?
Great question. Through the chair to Assemblymember Volland. I think we got about 5 to 10 comments total at different points through the process. We had some people that did show up and had some comments and questions at the hearing itself. We also got a fair number of questions and comments, formal comments by email as well.
Okay, great. Who do you typically hear from during that comment period? Is it entities, like the nonprofits involved in this, or is it individual community members? What's kind of the breakdown there?
It tends to be mostly the entities and current grantees, especially for recommending continued funding, typically comment. Partner organizations such as the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, they always comment. We occasionally get comments from individual citizens, not always. I don't think we got any on, well, no, we had at least one on this one, but more often it is the entities that have an interest in the programs.
Okay, just a couple more questions if it's okay. One thing I'd be interested in learning more about, so with the acquisition for housing money, can either one, any of these sources, I guess, CBDG, home, ESG, can they be used for utility upgrades? So let's say Cook Inlet has a project they want to build, they want to acquire the land, but they also want some assistance putting in the utilities. Because that's, I think, a big issue that we hear a lot about when it comes to the cost of housing. I'm thinking of, for instance, like 3rd and Ingra. They have the master plan for the former Native Hospital site. And the master plan now is a little bit outdated, but it identifies it would cost about $2 million just to put the utilities in there to make it buildable to achieve the plan. Is that something that these funds can be used for?
Yes, that is an eligible cost. And actually, so for CDBG, one of the constraints is that it generally can't be used for construction of new housing, but there are some exceptions to that or loopholes in that. And one is that it can be used to put in utilities for new housing. Utilities are potentially a cost that can be covered through these grants. The challenge with that then, though, is that the net counts as construction. And so then you start running into all the regulatory requirements on construction. So you have Davis-Bacon wages. We have a new Buy American, Build American Act where you have to use U.S. iron and steel. There's just a whole variety of hoops that you have to jump through once you start getting into construction, and utility work would count for that. Not in Super Bowl. I mean, we do it, but it is a consideration, in comparing just an acquisition versus acquisition and or putting in utilities.
Thanks. I think that'll be my final thing. Yeah, I think that would be interesting to stick a pin in as we go forward and look at that amendment process afterward. Another example that just comes to mind, and mine are mostly downtown focused, of course, but there's the former McKinley business building next to the Gaslight. It has those kind of funky bay windows. I know at one time I can't remember if it was the entire assembly, if it was just a few of us who supported a congressionally directed funding request to put utilities in there to like do some remodeling so that could be converted from commercial to housing. So just be interesting to explore that as an option going forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions from members? Okay. Well, I have a couple as well. Let me go back to my notes. So I guess one is stepping back, and I know you're relatively new in managing this project or this process. How much would you say that kind of these funding priorities have changed over recent years? Like, because you mentioned we're continuing things that we're doing. There's intent to look kind of bigger picture and maybe make changes in the future. But how much, and I know that these are 5-year plans, right? So how much is this the same kind of things that are being carried forward versus new things?
Great question. Thanks. Yeah. I'd say it's a mix at this point. Like some of the projects that we're currently doing are funding that was allocated in past years under a different set of priorities. And so we had like a whole set of small nonprofit upgrades to facilities. We're still working on one of those. Those projects have certain types of risks and certain types of like constraints. It's the same amount of work to manage a project regardless of the size. So the more small projects we do versus fewer larger projects, the more workload there is on us versus the benefit that we get from the project. And also, there's been shift in priorities over the past few years to more and more emphasize housing and homelessness versus community facilities and other potential uses. The shift toward doing more acquisition projects, fewer larger projects, I think that's been kind of conceptually a shift that has been in underway for a few years, but we're just now getting to the point of actually doing it. It's kind of a large, slow moving ship, and it takes some time to turn it. And so this is the past couple of years have also had these chunks of TBD funding for acquisition projects, but we didn't have the RFGP process set up. And so we were having trouble finding some of those projects. So putting some of these processes in place is allowing us to advance on some of those ideas that have been in place for a few years. I'd say if you were to compare this to the past couple of years of action plans, it is pretty similar.
And then, well, I guess I have another question, but also just put some comments on the record. So I'll note that we did get comments from the Anchorage Community Coalition and Homelessness with an interest in really stepping back, I think, and looking more holistically. And they identified some other funding sources, for example, alcohol tax that I think we're looking at. So I'll just say I'm interested in those comments and that work, but also acknowledge that this is on a timeline. So that's probably going to be our second phase. And then I'll also say, I think it is a challenge. There are a number of silos in the municipality that we know about, right? And I know because you guys are doing one form of planning, you're looking at HUD funding, you're focused on housing and homelessness, you're in the health department. We also have the planning department who's doing community land use planning and is the owner of those plans. And then there's these funding decisions, right? So there's all these other pieces. And I know there's a lot of organizations, the folks who are in the list now, others who are doing similar work. And I think everybody has an interest in knitting all that together, but it's going to take time. And I see nods, so I think you guys would agree. And so I think that's just to say, I know that's going to be a longer term conversation. But I also want to share and maybe get your response. And this is my question. I have heard from some folks, for example, Alaska Literacy Project, who were describing a lot of the really practical difficulties of using this funding. And I know you guys are familiar with those. And I think also one of the things that I've been investigating is how do we reuse older buildings without, for example, triggering or what happens now is triggering all of these code compliance upgrades. And I've heard, among other things, that this funding source is one of those issues where there's, desire to make the building safe, but it does. So I wonder if you could speak to kind of what is required as far as, rehabbing older buildings. And then is there room to maybe be more flexible than we've been in the past? And we can take that offline later too. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, great question. And yes, the Alaska Literacy project is an exceptionally good example of the challenges there. That was originally a small project to put in a lift, a sort of elevator like thing, and do a couple other upgrades to the building. Once we do, and this is the risk about the rehab projects I was mentioning before, because of the regulatory requirements around our funding, once we go in and start doing a rehab, if we find stuff that's not up to code, we have to bring it up to code. And so that can involve substantially more funding, which in the case of Alaska Literacy, the project ballooned 10 times in size to bring everything up to code. And we, luckily we did have the funding available to do that, but it is a risk. I think, it's tricky, and it's one of the reasons that we're, increasingly kind of trying to do acquisition projects and shy away from this kind of construction stuff, is because it is a risk. And, once we get in that situation, like, the only way out is through. We don't have a lot of other options unless we want to just leave them hanging, and, which in some cases could mean that they would have to cease operations because they don't have an operable building. So it is a risk. I don't, in terms of ways to be more flexible, it's hard in those cases. Municipality has control over municipal code. So if there's building code changes that could be made, that's one avenue. We have to bring it up to code. But what our regulations just say is that we have to meet all applicable local codes. So if there's changes to those, that would potentially be some more flexibility. And I know that's also a larger conversation. But yeah, our hands are tied by what's in the language of the regulations. And so to the extent that there's places those can be changed at the federal or at the local level, those are the levers that would be available for that.
Thanks. And then last question, and again, flag me down if you have any questions. Can you clarify one more time, and maybe it's going back to one of the prior slides. So there's CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, HOME. I don't remember what it stands for. It is different than the HOME Initiative. And then there's ESG, the Emergency Solutions Grant. Can you clarify again? Because I know we're talking a lot about homelessness. Housing is related to that. Which of these have to be used for homelessness prevention and response? And then which of them are kind of more broadly housing and homelessness? Just for our kind of understanding.
Yeah, great question. And, this presentation doesn't go as much into the differences between the programs as some of the other presentations we've given. But and I don't know if we have a slide that specifically looks at this, but I'll just bring up the one that shows the different ones here. So Community Development Block Grant, this is for a wide range of community development, but it cannot fund new housing construction. So it can fund acquisition for housing. It can fund rehab of housing, including conversion of non-residential to residential use, but it can't fund construction of new housing. It can fund the utilities being put in for new housing, but it can't fund the construction of new housing. So that's the big constraint there. Can fund services, including homelessness related services, and that is a lot of what we fund with it. HOME is actually not an acronym. It's just the word home, but they spell it as a initialism, as if it's an acronym. Yes, distinct from the HOME Initiative, which is confusing. But yes, HOME is kind of the complement to that. It is entirely focused on housing, primarily on new housing construction or acquisition or rehab. Although you can also do tenant-based rental assistance, and there's a few other types of things that are more like services that you can do through HOME. But HOME is primarily about new housing in a way that CDBG is not. And although HUD has put out recent guidance about, like, here are the types of housing related things you can do with CDBG, and there are a variety of them that you can do, but just straight up construction of new housing is a HOME rather than a CDBG thing, basically. ESG is really homelessness focused, and so it can actually be used for construction. It can be used for rehab, acquisition, can be used for all those things. But we primarily use it for services because it's a much smaller grant. It wouldn't go very far in a construction scenario. And I think that's the case for most communities that use ESG. But yes, it's it was originally emergency shelter. It's now broader than shelter, but it still is about like immediate response to homelessness, has to be spent within 2 years. So it's really more of a service oriented than an infrastructure oriented grant.
Thank you. And I know we're almost to time. Are there any other questions? Member Volin, go ahead.
Thank you. So I guess a question on the plan as it currently stands and comes before us on the 16th, 13th rather. Yeah, it has to be passed by the 16th. So 13th at a regular meeting or on the substantial amendment process. Was there any thought to use, and maybe it already is kind of woven in what you're proposing, although a lot of the stuff seems pretty TBD, but the Anchorage Assembly Housing Action Plan, was that looked at to inform this? Could it be looked at to inform the substantial amendment process?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, we have looked at it. We probably worth looking at again to inform the substantial amendment process, because definitely we'd want to draft the RFGP and then the subsequent substantial amendment to be consistent with those other plans, whether that's anchored home or that action plan, or, want to have all these things be consistent and pointing in the same direction. And we have some flexibility about, what exactly we put in that RFGP and what project we select so that we can tailor it to those other recommendations.
I would just submit that I think that would be really important, from our perspective as policymakers. That sort of is our policy directive when it comes to housing writ large in the municipality. So anyway, thank you for your work on this, Jed and team.
Okay, well, we are just at time, and I'll make one observation, which is I think given all the constraints, like you said, with these various funding types, I think one of our goals should be to really optimize how we use the funding. I'm sorry, my microphone seems to be back up. So just a reminder, this will be on our agenda for Tuesday. It has been indicated it's a must-pass item. The resolution, of course, if folks want, and we'll be looking to the future to discuss. Thank you very much, and we'll adjourn the work session.